entire squadron immediately. On the 2nd of July, the exhausted men who had been fighting on land prepared themselves for the inevitable combat at sea. The beginning of the end had started. At 9:30 in the morning on July 3rd, the Spanish squadron left Santiago through a long and narrow channel, requiring the ships to pass one after the other. The first to pass was the flagship Infanta Maria Teresa, followed by the Vizcaya, the Cristobal Colón, and the Almirante Oquendo. Following far behind were the torpedo boats or destroyers, Furor and Pluton. On leaving the port, the Spanish fleet encountered the American battleships and cruisers Brooklyn, Texas, Iowa, Oregon, Indiana, and the auxiliary ships Gloucester and Vixen, all forming a semicircle. The New York, with Admiral Sampson aboard, was further back as he was on his way for a meeting with Shafter and Siboney. At 9:35, the Teresa emerged from Santiago Bay with the crew deadly silent, after just having gone round the sandbank of Diamante between El Moro and La Socapa. The commander of the Teresa, Concas, recounts those moments. A solemn moment capable of making the bravest of hearts beat hard, from outside the combat turret in which I never wanted to enter in order to set an example for my defenseless crew, and because I knew if I did fall there would always be the Admiral to leave them, I asked for his permission to open fire. The bugle sounded, giving the signal to start fighting, the last echo of which history tells us was heard in the conquest of Granada. It marked the end of 4 centuries of greatness and the transformation of Spain into a fourth-class nation. Poor Spain, I said to the Admiral, and he contested meaningfully with a gesture of his head, as if saying he had done all that was possible to avoid it, and his conscience was clear. As soon as the Teresa emerged from the bay, she launched herself full speed towards the closest enemy ship, the Brooklyn, opening fire on it with use of all its power, except for the prow gun, which was reserved for shorter distances. At that moment, American artillery was focused on the Spanish flagship, which received the shower of fire and shrapnel coming from 4 of the American warships, the best it could. The Teresa was severely damaged when several grenades exploded on the stern, rendering the engine useless and reducing the speed of the ship. Almost simultaneously, several fires started, spreading quickly due to the large quantity of wood on board. Meanwhile, the Vizcaya, followed by the Colón, cleared the exit of the bay and, following the agreed-upon instructions, tried to escape without worrying about the enemy, which at that moment was concentrating on the mortally wounded flagship. The 4th cruiser to leave, the Oquendo, came under heavy fire even before appearing on the scene, rendering the prow large-caliber tower useless and causing large fires on board, resulting in the destruction of the vessel a half a mile from the flagship. Both split against the rocks. The destroyers Furor and Pluton, just barely in the open, became targets of the American warships that rapidly destroyed them in a disproportionate and unequal fight. The Pluton was practically split in 2 after being hit by a large caliber projectile from the Indiana, although she managed to go aground, saving the few surviving crew members. The Furor, after losing course and one of its engines, died an even more tragic death considering the depth of the water, which served as its grave. The Colón and the Vizcaya were the only ships left, and they tried to flee from the American squadron. The New York rapidly advanced towards them in order to block the Spanish ship's escape. The slow progress of the Vizcaya shortened the distance from the American ship, and after an hour and a half of fighting, it went aground in Cervera at 11:10 in the morning, converted into an inferno of death. The surviving crew members were left to face sharks and random shots from uncontrolled Cubans on shore. Under pursuit, the commander of the Colon received notice from the engine room that the good coal was running out. The situation was getting worse because the Oregon was gaining ground. Behind it followed the Brooklyn, Texas, and at a greater distance, the New York. The speed of the Colon was diminishing by the minute. Finally, Commander Diaz-Moreu, having been reached by the Americans and unable to continue fighting, gave the order to head towards the beach close to the mouth of the river Turquino, opening the bottom valves to ensure the complete loss of the cruiser and thus avoid the surrender to the enemy of the last ship in the Spanish squadron. All this happened at 1:45 in the afternoon. In 4 hours, 29,000 tons of warships and more than 112 cannons were lost, with casualties amounting to 323 dead and 151 wounded. American casualties consisted solely of 1 dead and 2 wounded aboard the cruiser Brooklyn. From data obtained after the fighting, it was found that the Spanish squadron had received 123 hits and the American squadron 64. If the number of shots fired from both sides is taken into account, as well as the position of the sun and the favorable placement of the American squadron, it can be deduced that the Spaniards were better shots, though this did not save them. It was not the American artillerymen who decided victory, but the success of their powerful cannons and armor and the superior skill of the machinists, especially those on board the Oregon. As far as the idea of escaping at night, which was considered on various occasions, it was discarded since the American fleet always used electric light projectors and were situated only 2 miles from the entrance of the port, not feeling threatened by the Spanish coastal batteries. Any attempt to escape would have resulted in the destruction of the guide ship and the loss of the rest, apart from a greater loss in drowned and missing men. After the naval combat, the shipwrecked reached the reefs in terrible condition. Most of them, wounded and semi-naked, were taken as prisoners either by General Sebreco's Cuban troops, who were nearby, or by the American troops sent to pick them up. The commander of the battleship Iowa, Evans, tells of the arrival of Captain Eulate, the commander of the Vizcaya, aboard his ship. He had lost a lot of blood and his head was covered with a blood-soaked